Goodness, hey, that's a good place to be from. So nice to see you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. All right, coming right around here. Very nice to see you, sir.
Hi, you look from Denmark.
So nice to see you. Yeah, good to see you again. How are you?
From Brazil.
Very nice to see you, sir. Very nice to see you. Thanks for having us. Very nice to see you. Thank you so much. Good to see you. So nice to see you so far. Yeah, of course.
Juan Carlos from Panama.
Good to see you again.
Hello.
So nice to see you. Well, you know what? She's the bigger star. So I know that. All right, come on. All righty. Everybody have a seat.
So I'm just going to give a very brief introduction because he doesn't really need an introduction. But I've had the privilege of talking to a bunch of you guys and love getting to know you. And
Fancy pens.
when we decided to come to Glasgow, he decided to come to Glasgow, it was really exciting to find out how many people who've been in Obama Foundation programs were already going to be here. Like,
Right.
We didn't bring anybody here.
Right.
You got your activism, your work brought you here. And so given that his focus when he called us and said he wanted to do this was talking to young people, to have this kind of group was so exciting. And to have Columbia, who's also a partner with us in our Scholars Program, be able to help us put this together was really exciting. So I'm going to help give prompt discussion after he makes some opening remarks, but I'm sure it'll evolve into just an open conversation, but we want to make sure we hear from everybody. And I mean, I guess I'll introduce my past, current, and future boss, Barack Obama.
Well, it is so good to see all of you. I've been, in some cases, following all of you from afar, and I always do my homework for these things. So I got, updates on each of you and all the amazing things that you've been doing. As Ben said, when I planned to come to Glasgow, part of the goal was to be helpful in any ways that I could at COP itself. But the first thing I said when some people suggested I go was my biggest interest probably would be to have a chance to meet with some of the activists, young activists who are involved on the ground, because those are my roots. That's where I come from. That's what I believe in. That's what the foundation is about. And as Ben said, when we found out that so many of you were going to be here anyway, representing various aspects of what your governments are being pushed to do, or in civil society you are trying to mobilize to make happen, it was a nice fit. And I do want to thank and acknowledge Columbia that is setting up one of the few climate schools, interdisciplinary programs in the United States. I have to acknowledge, since they're my alma mater, that I'm a little biased, but I'm also biased because they're a great partner with us for the Obama Scholars that some of you went through. I just gave a very long speech, so I'm not going to do a lot of talking. I want to spend more time listening. And I think the goal here is, in part, for me to hear from you. What are the things you feel hopeful about? What are the frustrations that you have? But also the ability for you to meet and learn from each other, exchange best practices. One of the goals that we've always had in everything we do through the foundation is to create essentially connective tissue between amazing activists across national borders, and even in some cases within national borders that don't know each other. Because the work you do is hard, and sometimes it's isolating, and sometimes you feel frustrated. And it helps when you feel you have a community. that you can learn from, that can support you, that knows what you're going through, and can be helpful and help celebrate when you have victories, so that you can then build on them. So with that, Ben, why don't you why don't you run this thing? And as I said, my goal here is to really hear from you guys. I might be jotting a few things down. I don't have to intervene each and every time. If you have a specific question or comment for me, or you want a thought, this will be we can make it into a not a formal structure, but I will be happy to respond to anything that people want me to respond to if they have specific questions, or if I'm so inspired by what you say, I just can't help myself. I might just say amen. So, all right, then kick it off.
Good. Well, I mean, I thought just to start, I mean, obviously, as President Obama talked about, very much the mood here is that there's a lot of progress being made, a lot of commitments being made, but a lot of frustration that more progress isn't being made. And I thought, Luisa, I'd start by asking you. We've talked about these things in the past, and you've been such a leader in mobilizing climate action. Kind of what's your mood? What's your impression of the first week here and where things stand?
Yeah, thank you so much. Should I also introduce myself?
Yes. And I should say, when you're talking, feel free to take your mask off and then.
But you should introduce yourself, because not everybody did their homework like I did. I'm just saying.
Okay, so everyone else, I'm Luisa Neubauer. I'm a climate justice activist from Germany, and we started organizing the Fridays for Future movement in Germany around about 3 years ago, actually after the COP in Poland, because we believe that privilege comes with responsibility, and if countries like Germany don't get started, who else will? Who can we expect to get going? We're one of the biggest emitters worldwide, and there's too much coal going out in our country, too much investment, etc. And I'm very happy to say we organized some of the largest mobilizations ever in our country. And when we had 1.5 million people on the streets and the government still wouldn't act, we sued the government in front of the Constitutional Court, and we won. Which means today there's actually an obligation for every country in the world to work with a carbon budget that is in line with the Paris Agreement. That counts for all of your government, this counts for all big companies, and it is actually known now, which I learned this morning, as the Neubauer case, which I'm a bit humbled about. And yes, so we're keeping on going. And here in Glasgow, we are actually meeting some of our international activists for the very first time ever, which is an incredibly exciting moment for the movement. And we are being asked a lot, is this a failure, is this a success now, this COP, and I think it's so easy to say, well, it's all a failure because it's more empty promises. But it seems so arrogant to me, given that so many activists and organizations like all of us have put so much effort into creating connection here, making capacity building happen, and so on. And so on the movement side, I think this is a human moment we can talk about. We saw the mobilizations. I am very, very worried about the democratic aspect of it, as people, especially activists, keep losing hope in their governmental pledges, in what often turns out as empty promises, in the lack of honesty about past failures, and also about the lack of global solidarity that we need. I mean, when I grew up, I was told to travel the world and learn the languages, and then everyone got irritated when I asked questions about what are we doing in other countries. Why are we building those pipelines over there? Why are we funding the exploitation? And so I think the next few days really need to turn things around. The money needs to come, the 100 billion pledge we're talking about. This needs to happen. And we need to see some real honesty and, of course, some action to take place.
Great. Well, I was also going to turn next to Jack. You're our host here, right? In the UK. What's your impression from the perspective of a host country, but also from the work you do?
Sure. I mean, firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel amongst so many inspiring young people. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've just been making a series for YouTube called Seat at the Table, in which I travelled the length of the UK, meeting young people and connecting with young people all around the world. And I have to be really honest here and say, when I started making that series, I was feeling quite hopeless. The recent IPCC report had come out, and I was sort of questioning what the point was of doing it at all. And it may sound a little cliche, but going on that journey and connecting with young people, meeting people on the ground who are taking matters into their own hands and organising within their own communities as well, not necessarily trying to create change on a global scale, but just doing their bit locally, has really inspired me and revitalised me. And it's given me a reason for hope. And this is my first COP. It's been fascinating being here, especially as the UK is hosting it this year. I'm very aware of the responsibility on our country to deliver. We kickstarted the Industrial Revolution in the first place. For me, what I've learned meeting humans on the front lines of this crisis is that this, as we all know, is an issue of social justice and human rights, not just an environmental issue. And I think for so long we've communicated it purely as an environmental issue and forgotten to tell the human stories at the heart of it. So my hope is that by communicating those, we can move people to take action. But I guess next week we will see, or at the end of this week, we'll see what the outcome is. And personally, being here, I've just been so inspired by the young people who are surrounding this event and organising. I was out at the youth strike on Friday, and nothing gives me hope like that does. And so, yeah, I suppose my sort of question on the top of my mind is, how can we better communicate this issue, particularly to world leaders, those who hold the levers of power, so that they take the urgent action necessary?
That might be a moment for you, a little bit about communication.
Well, yeah, and as a former world leader. Now I'm a has-been, but back then. I can still appreciate the mindset. Look, I don't expect that all of you had a chance to hear what I said at the forum, but for those who didn't, I think there's a couple of points in particular that I want to focus on. One is what Luisa said about, and what you echoed, the success of the movement shouldn't be diminished, even if some of the outcomes are unsatisfactory, because you're building power and you're raising awareness, and that's hard to do. And so using this as a catalyst for that in and of itself is significant. That'd be point number one. Point number two, the gist of my comments today were that there are some very real victories that occurred in Paris and that will occur in these couple of weeks here in Glasgow. And they are nowhere near sufficient. But that doesn't mean they're completely empty. So, let's say with respect to Paris, I think what I'm disappointed that there are a whole bunch of countries that did not necessarily meet what were already insufficiently ambitious targets. On the other hand, there's some countries that did. And there's some countries that now have ratcheted up their ambitions as we anticipated in Paris. Because the goal in Paris, we were always mindful that this was not sufficient, but if we could create at least the architecture, then the idea was that as technology advanced, as economies improved, because we were still close to the financial crisis and some of the economic problems that we had suffered, that those pledges would go up successively, so that by the time you got to Glasgow 5 years later, you could go hard. What we're seeing so far is that some of those national pledges have not gone up the way they needed to, but some have. And so then the question is, where are the places that really met our expectations? And it turns out that it's the countries where there was pressure, where there was political mobilization, where there was activism and a citizenry that demanded it. which then led me to, I think, my most important point of what I said here today, and that is, it's going to depend on you guys to apply that pressure. And when I talk to young people, including my own daughters, there are times where people get frustrated and their conclusion is, well, then we're just going to opt out of politics or try to work around politics. And part of my argument is you can't. Because essentially, no matter how much you'd like for global capitalists to suddenly become enlightened, no matter how much you'd like NGOs to be able to execute, the truth is that nation states still are setting the ground rules for how our economies operate and how energy policy is made. And so you have to have some control over those levers of power in order to meet the goals that we're going to need to meet. And along that, what I wanted to communicate is that it is not just a lack of cowardice on the part of leaders that prevents them from meeting these goals. It's the fact that, for at least those of us who live in democracies, there's not yet a full consensus. What is absolutely true is that fossil fuel industry using big money can try and can sometimes exert influence that far exceeds the views of ordinary citizens. There are those who are ideologically just opposed to climate science. Why, I don't fully understand, but they just are. And you'll never convince them. But the trickier part is in a lot of our countries, there are people who are afraid of change. And even if they're not full climate deniers, they're worried that the transition is not going to benefit them, and it might even hurt them. All right, so the examples I used in my speech today, like if you are a guy in America who, through no fault of your own, just how the country developed, you have no access to mass transit. It takes you a 50-kilometer drive to get to work and back. You can't afford a Tesla, so you've got an old truck that gets very bad mileage. And suddenly gasoline prices go up 20 cents. That's a big deal for you, right? And so maybe you're vaguely aware that you've got a climate catastrophe on the horizon, but you know you have a catastrophe if you can't pay your rent or you lose your job. There are people who, look, during Paris, one of the most challenging aspects of just getting Paris done was me convincing Prime Minister Modi of India and his various ministers to make a serious commitment, because even if the wealthy countries, advanced countries, all did what they should do, if India and China go on the same path of development as we, it doesn't matter what we do. We're still going to be under 4 feet of water, right? But as he pointed out, look, I've got several hundred million people who still don't have electricity, right? And so I've got to constantly weigh, what do I do with, if the only way that I can get electricity to some woman in a rural area who children literally at night, everything shuts down, they can't read, they can't do their homework. How do I explain to them that, well, we got to save the planet for something that you didn't do, right? So those politics matter, and I think that the big challenge that we're going to have, and this is not all my responses are going to be this long, but this one I thought was pretty important. One of the biggest challenges is I think we still have work to do just persuading the general public. And I think that the danger of our activism is that we're typically talking to people who already agree with us. we're not oftentimes talking to big parts of our populations that either don't agree with us or at least have different priorities. And that's going to require sort of grassroots work and messaging and effort that that many of you are already engaged in. So what I'm saying to you doesn't come as a surprise, but I think is important to remember. I think it can be done, and you guys are going to be the instrument by which it is done. But it's not simply that, you know, people in boardrooms are pulling strings as to why sometimes you don't get as much follow-through or ambition as you'd like. Sometimes it just has to do with the fact that within the politics within our various countries, at least those that are democracies, place constraints on even well-intentioned politicians. So, but I can continue on this theme later, as you know, but I want to hear from more people. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, no, to bring in like a couple of the different perspectives here. So, Nima, you're coming at it from a social entrepreneurship kind of perspective. Obviously, engaged with your own activism. What have been your impressions? What do you see as your role here in Glasgow?
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Nima. I'm from Denmark. I have a startup called Blue Lobster, which is basically a digital marketplace where we help connect sustainable fishermen directly with customers, and that way we pay the fishermen a better price and the customers get a better produce. But to this, this is my first COP ever, so I'm just trying to soak it all in. And I think, first of all, just to the point you were making about sometimes we have to talk to people who don't agree with us. And I think that's maybe where social impact entrepreneurship can actually play a strong role. Because we work in the fishing industry, so we go out there and we talk to fishermen using sustainable methods. And what we're finding is most of them, they're not using it because they believe in the climate change. In fact, when we come down and we talk about climate change, they're super reluctant, right? They're like, who's coming here? The Greenpeace people, like what is this? But what we can do is actually create an economic incentive for them to change their practices. So we can kind of innovate the supply chains and give them a reason. Where it's not because it's not altruistic motives. It is the fact that it's more efficient. We can do it in a smarter way. That means that you're going to get more money in your pocket. I think that's a role that the private sector can play in turning, this change that we ought to be part of. And in the bigger COP kind of thought, I don't know if this is right, but my impression is kind of like the activists, there's so much energy there. There's so much in the civil society sector. People are really, there's so much energy. You go down the streets, that's where it's most fun, right? Like that's where things are happening. Also in the blue zone and the places where these groups are. Then the policymakers, or the people going through the negotiations, man, it seems like such hard work. It seems like you really, and you got to keep people in a good mood. And what I'm trying to soak in from everyone, what I keep hearing is from previous COPs, the ones that were successful are where people were comfortable and were well fed and were like, it's like these really human aspects that make people in a good mood, good enough to go and make good negotiations. And then my question is kind of like, where does the private sector come in? Because what I think is maybe a shame is that the private sector, in some sense, I believe, has not been reduced to, but are portrayed as almost like a trade show, that they're here and then people are showing off their stuff, but they're not in, I don't know, but I'm not really seeing them being properly brought in. And some companies at this point, some companies are bigger than nations, both in terms of populations and economies, and there's a huge role for big companies to play as well. So I wonder how we can kind of bring in that aspect as well. And those are kind of my reflections.
No, it's great. And just to continue kind of gather some different perspectives. I mean, Juan Carlos, you obviously have the perspective of someone, in some of these rooms, with the
bad food, the bad lighting, no windows.
You need to see Nima about getting better food. What's been your experience here, and how do you see your role in relation to civil society and activism and the pressures for change?
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity. My name is Juan. I'm from Panama. I'm the head of delegation of Panama and also the coordinator of the Ambition Agenda for the ILAC bloc, which is basically 8 progressive Latin American countries We're sort of a third way within the negotiations. We don't fall into the developed countries divide. We believe everybody must do the most they can in order to reduce vulnerability. And I'm also happy to mention that Panama is bringing to this COP the youngest delegation of negotiators ever to come to a COP. The average age of our negotiators is 29 years. The average age of the lead negotiators is 27, and 65% of our negotiators are young women. So also, as of last Saturday, I am the new vice chair for implementation of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement. So we are getting a seat at the table, but it was not easy to get a seat at the table. We have to really fight for it. From my side, what we can do is, like, we're fighting to keep science alive. The only goal that we have at this COP is to keep the 1.5 goal alive. And in order to do that, we need to get a decision in the covered portion of the COP that asks for the reduction of 45% by 2030, a direct call to science. But in order to get that, we also need a decision that calls for all countries to redo their pledges, because as the citizens reports tells us, as civil society tells us, we are lagging behind. We're on a pathway to 2.7. That's almost double the pathway that should be embarking on. But also, in order to do that, we need the most developed nations to actually present the decarbonization plans. They're just presenting, net zero pledges, decarbonization pledges, and they put a year, but they're not telling us what are the pathways that their most, polluting sectors are actually going to embark and how they're going to do it. But in order to do that, we also need a decision that starts aligning climate finance with the actual scientific need to stay in 1.5. Yes, 100 billion is great, and we need to fulfill it, but that's more about, the political will and to keeping the trust in the system. But we need trillions. 100 billions is just like pennies, in all this game. And as Nima was mentioning, we need the private sector to get involved. Paris has 3 goals: temperature limit, increase of resilience, and the third one is the complete transformation of the global financial system. And that's the goal that not many people are talking about. And can capitalism actually fix the crisis that it created? We better hope it does, or we better push it to do it, because I don't see time to reformulate the whole economy. So I guess that's my take on the work that people like Luisa do is what we need, so that I get more work in my desk, and my ministers on the political level people actually get things speed up.
Great, and just to collect one more perspective, Guillermo, you're working in the ideas generation business here, social entrepreneurship, negotiation, activism, documentary film. What's been your perspective, based on the work you do, seeing things in action here?
Thank you so much, President. My name is Guilherme. I was the co-founder of the Brazilian Solar Energy Association. I was one of the responsible to implement the solar energy policies in Brazil. Then I went to the Ministry of Mines and Energy, stayed there for 3 years, also with renewable energy and climate change. Then I went to Obama Foundation Scholar. And today, after I lost my father in a car accident, exactly 1 week after I finished your program, I took his institution, and now I'm running his institution. And we have a very interesting project, which is Governors for Climate. We're now on board 25 governors. And this has been huge, because we have also governors who are aligned with the president, saying they understand to maintain their sustainable agriculture is important, to maintain our forest stand is important. So we are very focused working in the subnational level. Again, thinking globally and act locally, which is the most important thing, because when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about people's life. In Brazil, with this weather, there are a lot of people that don't have money to buy an air conditioner. The flooding in the structure of the house that they live. This is what we are talking about, and that we need to implement. So we need the local, we need the subnational level to be engaged and fully. The NDC have to go to the subnational level. And that's the work that we are trying to do. Thank you so much.
Excellent. A couple of things I'll respond to. First of all, Nima's observation that we need better food for the delegation is vitally important. I'm joking a little bit, but I think you identified something that's important, which is, this is a human enterprise, and sort of, and we have to remind ourselves sometimes of that, right? That these are just people sitting around a table and they're trying to figure stuff out, and everything we can do to encourage them to move better and more ethically and more ambitiously, we should do. And sometimes that involves pressure, sometimes that involves a pat on the back, sometimes it involves better food. I'm really love the example you used about just talking to fishermen, right? Because fishermen, that's a hard job. There are long traditions of how to do it. They may, in the abstract, understand that the ocean is not a limitless resource, and you can talk to them about acidification and a whole bunch of other scientific data, but at the end of the day, what they're really trying to figure out is how to feed their families, right? And finding ways like you have done to think about how can we improve and incentivize, whether through technology or through market connections or what have you. You can bring home as much or more, but do it in a sustainable way. That, I think, is a critical role not only for the private sector to play, but for policy thinkers and institutes and regulatory structures to do, right? How can we make sure that a farmer doesn't need to use the same sort of pollutants or carbon-intensive strategies in order to grow more crops? How can we replace a dirty power plant